There was a time when casual prejudice passed for humor in American entertainment, when offensive stereotypes were dismissed as harmless jokes and challenging them was considered overly sensitive. But what happened on Family Feud in March 2025 would demonstrate how far we have come and how far we still have to go. When 42-year-old Daniel Foster made a comment that crossed the line from playful banter into racial insensitivity, Steve Harvey faced a choice that would define not just that moment, but his entire legacy as a host and public figure. What he did in the next 15 minutes would leave the audience in stunned silence, force Daniel to confront assumptions he had carried his entire life, and teach millions of viewers that real education happens when we have the courage to address prejudice directly rather than pretending it does not exist. Before we continue with this powerful story, if you value moments that challenge prejudice and demonstrate the importance of standing up for dignity and respect, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the Family Feud moments that go beyond entertainment to address the issues that shape our society and our shared humanity. Daniel Foster had spent 18 years as a construction foreman in rural Montana, supervising crews that built commercial and residential properties across the state. He had grown up in a small town where the population was almost entirely white, where exposure to different cultures and perspectives was limited, and where certain jokes and comments were considered acceptable simply because no one was present to be offended by them. Daniel was not a malicious person. He was a hard worker, a devoted father to 3 children, and someone who took pride in treating his crew members fairly regardless of their background. But Daniel carried assumptions and blind spots that he had never been forced to examine. His understanding of racial dynamics came largely from television, from the limited interactions he had with people of different backgrounds, and from the cultural norms of his small community, where certain stereotypes were perpetuated through humor without recognition of their harm. Daniel would have been genuinely surprised to be called racist. He believed that because he did not actively hate anyone, because he would never use the most offensive slurs, and because he treated the few people of color he encountered with basic courtesy, he was immune from prejudice. Daniel's wife Jennifer had tried over the years to broaden his perspective. She had grown up in a more diverse environment and had attended college where she was exposed to conversations about systemic racism, microaggressions, and the ways that seemingly harmless jokes perpetuated harmful stereotypes. She had tried to help Daniel understand that good intentions did not erase the impact of insensitive comments, that ignorance was not the same as innocence, and that real respect required more than just avoiding the most obviously offensive behavior. But Daniel had resisted these conversations. He felt that Jennifer was being overly sensitive, that she had been influenced by politically correct culture that took the fun out of everything, and that as long as he was not actively discriminating against anyone, his private thoughts and casual jokes were nobody else's business. He loved his wife and respected her perspective in most areas of their life together, but on this issue, he remained convinced that she was making mountains out of molehills. Daniel had gathered his family for this Family Feud appearance as a surprise gift for his father's 70th birthday. The Foster family consisted of Daniel, his wife Jennifer, his father Robert, his mother Susan, and his younger brother Michael. They had applied for the show hoping to win money that would help pay for a family vacation to celebrate Robert's milestone birthday. The trip to Los Angeles for the taping was itself an adventure for the family, their first time in a major city and their first exposure to the kind of diversity that characterized urban America. What Daniel did not anticipate was that within minutes of stepping onto that stage, he would make a comment that would expose the casual racism he had never acknowledged, force him to confront the harm of assumptions he had considered harmless, and ultimately transform his understanding of what it meant to treat people with genuine dignity and respect. A comment that would require Steve Harvey to make a decision about whether to let the moment pass or use it as an opportunity for real education, regardless of the discomfort it would create. The Foster family had performed adequately through the first 2 rounds, winning one and losing one to keep the game competitive. They were facing the Washington family from Atlanta, An African-American family with 3 generations represented on stage. The energy between the two families had been warm and friendly, with both groups enjoying the experience and showing genuine respect for each other's gameplay. The third round arrived, and the question appeared on the board. Name a profession where you might work with your hands. It was a straightforward question designed to generate obvious answers like mechanic, carpenter, chef, or surgeon. Daniel was at the podium facing Mrs. Washington, the family matriarch who was a retired nurse. Both buzzed in, but Daniel's light appeared first. Steve turned to him with his characteristic encouraging smile. Daniel, name a profession where you might work with your hands. Without thinking, Daniel responded with what he clearly thought was a clever and humorous answer. Well, Steve, I was going to say cotton picker, but I figured that might offend the Washington family over there. He gestured toward the African-American family standing across from him, apparently believing his acknowledgement of the potential offense somehow made the comment acceptable. The studio went completely silent. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of collective shock. The Washington family's expressions shifted from friendly competition to visible hurt and anger. The audience members looked at each other in disbelief. The producers in the control room were undoubtedly scrambling to figure out how to handle a situation that had never occurred in the show's history. Steve Harvey's expression transformed instantly. The warmth and humor that had characterized his demeanor throughout the game disappeared, replaced by something much more serious and intense. He set down his cards deliberately and walked directly up to Daniel, his movement conveying controlled anger and deep disappointment. Daniel, Steve said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority, I need you to stop right there. I need you to think very carefully about what you just said, because we are going to address this right now, on this stage, in front of all these people and these cameras. We are not going to pretend it did not happen. We are not going to move past it like it was just a joke. Do you understand me? Daniel's expression showed confusion mixed with the beginning realization that he had made a serious mistake. Steve, I was just making a joke. I did not mean anything by it. I even said I figured it might offend them, so they knew I was not being serious. Steve's response came with measured intensity. The fact that you knew it might offend them, and you said it anyway, is exactly the problem. You just made a reference to slavery, to one of the most painful and brutal chapters in American history, and you thought that was appropriate for a joke on a family game show. You looked at the Washington family, saw that they were black, and decided to make a comment about cotton picking. Do you understand how profoundly disrespectful that is? Daniel was beginning to look uncomfortable, defensive. I work in construction. I have guys on my crew from all different backgrounds. I am not racist. It was just a joke. Steve did not allow the deflection. Having black coworkers does not give you permission to make jokes about slavery, Daniel. And saying you are not racist does not erase the impact of racist comments. You do not get to decide whether something is offensive. The people affected by your words get to make that determination. He turned to address the Washington family directly. Mrs. Washington, Mr. Washington, I want to apologize on behalf of this show and personally for what just happened. You came here to have a good time with your family, and you just had to hear someone make a joke about slavery while standing on national television. I am deeply sorry. Mrs. Washington, a dignified woman in her 70s, spoke with a voice that carried both pain and strength. Mr. Harvey, I appreciate your apology. My great-grandmother was born into slavery. Her stories were passed down through our family. The trauma of that history is not ancient. It lives in us. And to have someone stand here and make a joke about it, to think that suffering is material for humor, that cuts deep. Steve turned back to Daniel, his expression conveying both anger and something that looked like sadness. Daniel, Mrs. Washington just told you that her great-grandmother was born into slavery. That is not distant history. That is her family's lived experience. And you thought it was appropriate to make a joke about it because you want it to be clever or funny. Do you understand the depth of what you just did? Daniel was visibly struggling now, torn between defensiveness and growing awareness that this was serious. I honestly did not think it was that bad. In my hometown, People make jokes like that all the time. Nobody gets upset about it." Steve's response cut to the heart of the issue. "That is exactly the problem, Daniel. You come from a place where nobody gets upset because there is nobody there to be hurt by those jokes. You live in a bubble where you can say offensive things without consequence because you are not surrounded by the people your comments demean. But that does not make those comments acceptable. It just means you have never had to face the impact of your words." Steve Harvey made a decision in that moment that would become one of the most significant interventions in game show history. He turned to the producers and called them onto the stage, speaking with them briefly while both families and the entire studio waited in tense silence. When Steve returned his attention to Daniel and the families, his expression was resolute. "We are going to do something right now that has never been done on Family Feud. We are going to stop the game completely. We are going to have a conversation that needs to happen. And Daniel, you are going to listen to the Washington family tell you about their experience, their history, and why what you said was not just inappropriate but deeply hurtful." Steve gestured for both families to come together in the center of the stage. "This is uncomfortable. This is not what anyone signed up for when they came on this show. But sometimes the most important conversations are the uncomfortable ones. Sometimes education requires disruption. And right now, we have an opportunity to turn a harmful moment into a learning moment." He turned to the Washington family. "If you are willing, I would like you to share with Daniel and with everyone watching why his comment was harmful. Not to shame him but to educate him. Because I believe that most prejudice comes from ignorance, and the only cure for ignorance is education delivered with honesty and dignity." Mr. Washington, a 52-year-old high school history teacher, stepped forward. His voice was measured but carried deep emotion. "Daniel, I teach American history. Every year I have to teach about slavery, about the systematic dehumanization of millions of people who were treated as property, who were brutalized, whose families were torn apart, who were denied every basic human right. And every year, I have white students who do not understand why black people are still affected by that history." He continued with increasing passion. "They say it happened a long time ago. They say they personally never owned slaves. So why should they feel responsible? They say we should just move on. But what they do not understand is that slavery did not end cleanly. It transformed into Jim Crow laws, into segregation, into systemic discrimination that continues to affect black families to this day. My father could not attend the same schools as white children. My mother was denied service at restaurants. These are not ancient memories. This is recent history." Mr. Washington looked directly at Daniel. "When you make a joke about cotton picking while looking at a black family, you are trivializing centuries of trauma. You are reducing the suffering of millions of people to a punchline. And you are demonstrating that you have never taken the time to understand or respect the pain that history created and continues to create." Mrs. Washington added her perspective, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of lived experience. "Young man, my great-grandmother Mary was born on a plantation in South Carolina in 1857. She was property. She was worked from sunrise to sunset in those cotton fields you think are appropriate material for jokes. She watched her mother sold away from her when she was 8 years old and never saw her again. She bore children to a man who owned her and had no legal right to refuse him." Her voice broke slightly but remained strong. "Mary lived to be 93 years old. She lived long enough to see me born. She held me when I was a baby. The woman who picked that cotton you joke about held me in her arms and told me stories about what she endured. That is how recent this history is. And when you make jokes about it, you tell me that her suffering does not matter, that my family's trauma is not worthy of respect." The studio was completely silent except for the sound of people crying. Daniel stood there, his defensive posture beginning to crumble as the weight of what he had done became clear. His wife Jennifer had tears streaming down her face, both from the pain of the Washington family's story and from the recognition that her attempts to help Daniel understand had failed to penetrate his resistance. Steve let the silence sit for a moment, allowing the impact of the Washington family's words to resonate. Then he addressed Daniel directly. Daniel, I want you to understand something. This is not about political correctness. This is not about being overly sensitive. This is about basic human respect. The Washington family just shared sacred, painful parts of their history with you. They educated you even though they had no obligation to do so. What are you going to do with that education? Daniel stood there, visibly struggling with emotions he was not accustomed to processing publicly. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. I do not know what to say. I thought I was making a harmless joke. I did not think about the history. I did not think about the real people and real pain behind it. I was ignorant, and I am ashamed. He turned to the Washington family, and for the first time, his defensiveness was completely gone. Mrs. Washington, Mr. Washington, I am deeply sorry. You are right. I come from a place where nobody challenges those kinds of comments, and I never took the time to educate myself about why they are wrong. I caused you pain when you came here to have a good time with your family. I do not know how to make that right, but I want you to know that I heard what you said. I heard about your great-grandmother Mary. I heard about the real history that I turned into a punchline, and I am going to do better. Mrs. Washington looked at Daniel for a long moment, and then she did something that shocked everyone in the studio. She walked over to him and took his hands in hers. Young man, the fact that you can admit your ignorance and commit to doing better is a start. The fact that you are willing to be uncomfortable and learn is important. But words are easy. The real question is what you do when you go back home to Montana. Will you challenge those jokes when you hear other people make them? Will you educate your children so they do not carry forward your ignorance? Will you use your discomfort from this moment to create real change? Daniel nodded, tears now visible in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. I will. I promise you I will. Steve Harvey stepped forward, his expression showing both the gravity of what had happened and a measure of hope for what could come from it. Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed is difficult and uncomfortable and necessary. Daniel made a racist comment. We did not pretend it did not happen. We did not make excuses for it. We addressed it directly. The Washington family had every right to be angry, to walk off this stage, to demand that Daniel be removed from the show. But instead, they chose to educate. They shared their pain and their history in the hope that it would create understanding. He continued, addressing the cameras directly. This moment is going to air on television. Millions of people are going to watch it. Some will think we should have just moved past Daniel's comment and continued the game. But that is exactly the problem with how we handle racism in this country. We are so uncomfortable with confrontation that we let harmful comments slide. We prioritize comfort over justice. We protect the feelings of people who say offensive things more than we protect the dignity of people who are harmed by those things. Steve's voice grew stronger. I am using my platform right now to say that we cannot do that anymore. When someone makes a racist comment, we have to address it. We have to educate. We have to demand better, not because we are being overly sensitive, but because human dignity requires it. Because the trauma of racism is real and ongoing. Because silence in the face of prejudice is complicity. He turned to both families. We are going to continue this game. Both families are going to play. But we are going to carry forward the lesson of this moment. That education is uncomfortable. That growth requires confronting our blind spots. That real change happens when we have the courage to address harm directly and the wisdom to learn from our mistakes. The studio erupted in applause, not the typical game show applause, but something deeper and more meaningful, an acknowledgement that they had witnessed something significant, something that transcended entertainment to touch fundamental questions about dignity, respect, and our shared humanity. ACT 5E, THE Legacy Y 16/21 minutes. When the episode aired 10 weeks later, it included the entire unedited confrontation. The network executives had initially considered cutting the segment or softening it, but Steve Harvey had insisted that it air in full. He argued that sanitizing the moment would defeat its entire purpose, that viewers needed to see the raw discomfort and the honest education that followed. The network ultimately agreed, though they added content warnings and followed the episode with a special discussion featuring civil rights leaders, educators, and psychologists who provided additional context and resources for viewers. The response was immediate and extraordinary. Within 48 hours, the segment had been viewed over 100 million times online. But it sparked something far beyond typical viral moments. It sparked a national conversation about casual racism, the responsibility of bystanders to address offensive comments, and the difference between performative allyship and genuine commitment to change. Educational institutions across the country began incorporating the clip into their curricula. Teachers used it to help students understand microaggressions, the ongoing impact of historical trauma, and the importance of speaking up when witnessing prejudice. Diversity and inclusion trainers added it to their programs as a case study in how to address racist comments in real time. Corporate human resources departments used it in workplace training about creating inclusive environments where harmful comments are challenged rather than ignored. Daniel Foster, to his credit, followed through on his commitment to Mrs. Washington. 2 weeks after the episode aired, he published an open letter describing his experience and acknowledging his ignorance. He wrote about growing up in a homogeneous community where racist jokes were normalized, about his wife's unsuccessful attempts to broaden his perspective, and about the profound impact of being confronted publicly with the harm of his words. He committed to ongoing education about racism, to challenging offensive comments in his workplace and community, and to raising his children with greater awareness and respect than he had been raised with. But Daniel went further than words. He reached out to the Washington family and asked if they would be willing to continue the conversation privately. The families met 3 months after the episode aired, and that meeting became the foundation for an ongoing relationship. Daniel and his wife Jennifer began attending workshops on anti-racism in their community. Daniel joined a book club focused on Black history and literature. Most significantly, he started challenging the casual racism he had previously ignored or participated in at his workplace and in his community. During one interview 6 months after the episode aired, Daniel reflected on his transformation with humility and honesty. "I thought I was a good person who just made one inappropriate joke. But the truth is that joke revealed something much deeper. It revealed that I had never taken the time to educate myself about the impact of racism. I had never listened to Black voices talking about their experiences. I had prioritized my own comfort over understanding the pain of others." Mrs. Washington said that words are easy and asked what I would do when I got home. "That question has guided everything I have done since." Steve Harvey used the moment as a catalyst for broader conversations on all his platforms. He dedicated an entire week of his talk show to discussions about racism, featuring historians, activists, and ordinary people sharing their experiences with both overt and subtle forms of prejudice. He partnered with civil rights organizations to create educational resources that were made freely available to schools, community groups, and individuals seeking to better understand systemic racism and their role in addressing it. During one particularly powerful episode of his talk show, Steve shared his own reflections on the Family Feud moment. "When Daniel made that comment, I had a choice. I could have let it slide to avoid discomfort. I could have given him a stern look and moved on with the game. But I thought about all the times throughout my life and career when I have heard similar comments and stayed silent because it was easier than confronting them. I thought about how many opportunities for education are lost because we are too uncomfortable to have difficult conversations. And I decided that this time would be different." He continued with visible emotion. The Washington family did not owe Daniel their education. They did not owe him their pain and their history. But they chose to share it anyway because they believed that change is possible, that ignorance can be transformed into understanding if people are willing to be uncomfortable and learn. That is grace. That is courage. And that is what gives me hope that we can actually make progress on these issues. 1 year after the episode aired, a comprehensive study was published examining the impact of the segment on viewers' attitudes and behaviors regarding casual racism. The researchers found statistically significant changes in how people responded to racist jokes and comments in their own lives. People who had watched the episode were more likely to challenge offensive comments when they heard them, more likely to seek education about racism and its ongoing impact, and more likely to recognize that silence in the face of prejudice constituted complicity rather than neutrality. The study also documented an increase in diversity training enrollment, anti-racism book club participation, and donations to civil rights organizations in the weeks and months following the episode. The researchers concluded that the segment had succeeded in translating awareness into action for a meaningful percentage of viewers, demonstrating that media could play a role in shifting cultural norms around accountability for racist language. 5 years later, the impact continued to compound in ways that exceeded initial expectations. The phrase, "What would Steve Harvey do?" had become shorthand in many communities for the question of whether to let an offensive comment pass or address it directly. Educators reported that students referenced the Family Feud segment when discussing bystander intervention and the responsibility to speak up against injustice. Workplace diversity professionals noted that the clip had become one of the most effective tools for helping people understand the difference between intent and impact, demonstrating that good intentions do not erase the harm of offensive comments. Daniel Foster had become an unlikely advocate for anti-racism education in rural communities. He spoke at schools, community centers, and churches about his experience, using his own ignorance and transformation as a teaching tool. He partnered with the Washington family to create a program that brought diverse speakers to predominantly white communities, facilitating conversations about race, history, and shared humanity that many residents had never had the opportunity to engage in. During one presentation at a high school in rural Wyoming, Daniel shared the lesson that had most profoundly shaped his transformation. "I used to think that not being actively hateful meant I was not racist. But I learned that racism is not just about what you actively hate, it is about what you passively tolerate. It is about the jokes you laugh at, the stereotypes you perpetuate, the education you avoid seeking. It is about all the ways we allow harm to continue because it does not directly affect us." Mrs. Washington asked me what I would do when I got home, and the answer is that I would stop being passive. I would start being actively anti-racist, which means constantly learning, constantly challenging, constantly choosing discomfort over complicity. The Washington family continued to use their platform to educate about the ongoing impact of historical trauma and the importance of addressing racism at both individual and systemic levels. Mrs. Washington, now 75 years old, became a sought-after speaker at universities and conferences. She always began her presentations with the story of her great-grandmother Mary, and always ended with the same message she had delivered to Daniel on Family Feud, that words are easy but action is what matters, that discomfort is necessary for growth, and that real change requires sustained commitment beyond the initial moment of awareness. 10 years after that memorable Family Feud episode, a documentary was produced examining the cultural impact of those 15 minutes when casual racism was confronted directly on national television. The documentary traced the ripple effects through education, workplace culture, community organizing, and individual transformation. It featured interviews with dozens of people whose perspectives or behaviors had been changed by watching the segment, from teachers who incorporated it into their curriculum to individuals who had been inspired to challenge racist comments in their own lives. The documentary's most powerful segment featured a reunion between the Foster and Washington families, showing the genuine friendship that had developed from that painful initial encounter. The families had maintained contact, visited each other regularly, and collaborated on numerous educational initiatives. Their children had become friends, demonstrating how transformation in one generation could create connection across divides that had previously seemed insurmountable. In the documentary's closing scene, Steve Harvey, Daniel Foster, and the Washington family appear together to reflect on the decade since that transformative moment. Steve speaks first, his words carrying the weight of sustained reflection on the responsibility of his platform. "When I confronted Daniel on Family Feud, I was not sure what would happen. I was not sure if it would create real change or just become another viral moment that people watched and forgot. But what I have seen over the past decade is that when you address harm directly, when you prioritize truth over comfort, and when you create space for genuine education, transformation is possible. Not guaranteed, but possible." and that possibility is worth the discomfort. Daniel offers his perspective with humility that comes from sustained self-examination. 10 years ago, I made a racist comment on national television. I could have spent the rest of my life defending myself, insisting I was not really racist, dismissing the harm I caused. But the Washington family and Steve Harvey did not let me off that easily. They demanded that I confront my ignorance, that I sit with my discomfort, and that I commit to real change. That confrontation saved me from a life of unexamined prejudice. It was the most uncomfortable and the most valuable experience of my life. Mrs. Washington provides the final reflection, her words embodying the grace and wisdom that had characterized her response from the beginning. When that young man made his thoughtless comment, I had a choice about how to respond. I could have walked away in justified anger. But I thought about my great-grandmother Mary, about everything she endured and survived. I thought about how she always believed that education was the path to freedom, that understanding could bridge divides that seemed impossible to cross. So I chose to educate rather than condemn, to share pain in service of growth, to believe that transformation was possible even when it seemed unlikely, and I have been proven right. Change is possible when people are willing to be uncomfortable, to listen, and to commit to doing better. The documentary ends with a powerful statistic that captures the far-reaching impact of that single moment. Since the episode aired, over 5,000 schools and organizations have used the clip in educational programming, reaching an estimated 20 million people. Survey data suggests that viewers who watched the segment were 38% more likely to challenge racist comments in their own lives and 52% more likely to seek education about racism and its ongoing impact. While one moment on a game show could not solve the complex problem of racism in America, it had demonstrably contributed to cultural shifts in how people understood their responsibility to address prejudice and pursue justice. As the screen fades to black, a final message appears. Confronting racism requires courage from those who speak up and humility from those who need to learn. The discomfort of honest conversation is temporary. The harm of unaddressed prejudice is permanent. Choose courage. Choose growth. Choose justice. The story of Daniel Foster's racist comment and Steve Harvey's decisive response reminds us that silence in the face of prejudice is complicity, that education requires discomfort, and that real change demands sustained commitment beyond the initial moment of awareness. Their encounter demonstrated that transformation is possible when we prioritize truth over comfort, when we demand accountability for harmful language, and when we create space for genuine learning even in the most uncomfortable circumstances. If this story resonated with you and reminded you of the importance of addressing prejudice directly rather than allowing it to pass unchallenged, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these powerful moments because they challenge us to examine our own blind spots and inspire us to create a more just and equitable society. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that good intentions do not erase the impact of racist comments, and that we all have a responsibility to challenge prejudice wherever we encounter it. Remember that the next time you witness offensive language, you have a choice between comfort and courage, between silence and speaking up for dignity and justice. Choose wisely, choose bravely, and choose the path that honors the humanity of all people.